Once again, if everybody will find a seat, and if we can tone the volume down just a little bit. Again, I would like to welcome all of the combined classes here to hear the finale of the series that Lester's doing. Lester, thank you so much for doing this. It has truly been educational and inspirational, everything else. Very, very well. We're going to save announcements to the very end, but there was one thing I was going to say, forget it. Anyway, Lester. Oh, I know what it was. The next series is with Paul McCracken. That is a 4-week series, 4 or 5 weeks, 4-week series with Paul McCracken with the Aldersgate class. Other classes are welcome to participate. I've only heard from one so far that has opted in. So if your class wants to opt in, please let us know so we can work on logistics. So anyway, Lester, it's up to, there you go.
Well, good morning, everybody. We're on our last book of the Torah. And you know, of course, what we do when we get to the end of Deuteronomy, we start over, right? That's what one does. And we're not going to start over here, but if I'm a warm-up act for Paul, you're in good hands. Paul is a real treasure to this church, and I work with him so closely, and he's just, his whole family is just amazing, and his mom with the records at Sumatanga and oh my gosh, At one time, I was playing some sort of conference event at Trinity, and I'm on the organ at Trinity, and everybody's place is packed out. And there's some brass players, and I noticed Carolyn McCracken was back there with her trumpet and everything, but then she started playing, and it was like, there's trumpet playing and there's trumpet playing. I mean, there's kind of, for classical and like hymns and stuff, you play in a certain way, and it was like Herb Alpert was behind me, I was kind of getting this salsa trumpet thing going a little bit, and I was like, what the heck? It's Carolyn. And she was wailing on that thing. And anyway, but Paul's a great asset. He and Nancy too. And Nancy, of course, is the secret weapon. Maybe not so secret, but anyway. I know you'll enjoy that. All right, so we are at Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy itself means the second recitation, the second telling of all of this. So it's very recapitulative. I loved the thing about that Rabbi Moffick starts the chapter on Deuteronomy talking about he started a year-long partnership with a Christian minister, a friend of his, a colleague, and he said, well, why do you want to study Deuteronomy? That's why he just wanted to study Deuteronomy for a year. And he said, well, it's the most quoted part of the Torah in the New Testament. I didn't know that, but it's eminently quotable. I'll tell you that. And it is just a massive review of everything that has been going before. And it's not only that, but in many respects, it's a second interpretation. And I think that sets the bar for the fact that there have been thousands of interpretations since then, and that, as the heavenly voice said in the Sanhedrin those days, all arguments for the sake of heaven are valid. So God loves a good argument if it's in the name of heaven. The Hebrew is from, again, the first significant word. And boy, is this a loaded word. Devar means word. Devarim is plural, masculine plural. But it translates words. That's what most people would think of immediately, would be words. But it's more than words. It's discourses, it's conversation, it is teaching, it is just a word that is full of possibility, and it sort of defines the idea of that Jews have been known as the people of the book, because it is the scriptures that are so central, and this, of course, is the summary of the Torah in the Bible. So Devarim also has its resonance in the Gospels. In the book of John, in the beginning was Hadvar, the Word. And so Christians impart a powerful association with the word Devar to one of the most very central tenets of our faith, the Word. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And you know that by heart, of course. So it is a powerful word indeed. The organization of it is all about the words. This is Moses. We're at the end of the 40 years. Time again sort of stops or slows greatly down. And we don't have a lot of history here. Most of Deuteronomy is ascribed to a unique author called the Deuteronomist. This started in the 19th century in that sort of breakthrough scholarship on the authorship of the Hebrew Scriptures. But it's broken down into a series of speeches, a series of words, of discourses. Moses' first, the second, and the third discourse. It starts with a prologue, and then finally we get a little closing history that the last oration and the blessing and Moses' farewell. And then the death of Moses, the last chapter in Deuteronomy, is extremely short. And it is the shortest Torah portion in the annual cycle of the Torah readings that every Sabbath is named for the portion you're reading. We are actually, this past Shabbat, yesterday and Friday night, it was Shabbat Yitro. And Yitro is Jethro, and it's that part of Exodus where Jethro advises Moses and is the counsel to him, and this sort of thing. So that's where they are. They're out in the wilderness now, and they're just they've just escaped and all this kind of thing. So that's where it is. Rabbi Grafman of blessed memory used to tell me that when you got to the first Torah portion of the year, that is Deuteronomy 1, it's called Shabbat Devarim. And Shabbat Devarim always comes in very late summer, and it's about maybe 6 weeks before the Jewish New Year, because there's about that many Sabbaths usually before the Jewish New Year. And he stopped by my office while I was working there, and he said, "It's Shabbat Devarim." I said, "Yes, sir." He says, "It's time to prepare." And he just walked away. And so that was, you better have your sermons ready. I'm sure ministers do the same thing. They probably go, they get on Ash Wednesday and go, "Okay, I've got 45 days to an Easter sermon." And so we have these things. Moving in Jewish time is a rare privilege, and it's hard to do outside of maybe New York. But when you get to it's kind of fun. Jewish time is kind of laid back. Anyway, that'll get off on that. All right, so what do we got? So this is it. This is basically the organization of Deuteronomy. And almost everything from Exodus onward, and even some before that, is recapped in Deuteronomy. Here's some interesting things. There is more first person in Deuteronomy than any place else in the Torah. Moses actually using first person pronoun talking to, these are fireside chats. They're long, long fireside chats. And it's that sort of a very personal voice that we really don't hear. It's not that, you shall do this, you shall not do that, but it's got more, remember what we did and I did and everything. So we have a lot of first person. Moses, of course, speaks a lot. For a man who was slow of speech and slow of tongue, he got over it. As Tevye says in Fiddler on the Roof, for a man who was slow of tongue, he certainly talked a lot. But it's not autobiographical. Moses does not talk about himself or his life, but he speaks rather as a prophet. It's really the first book of the Torah that is narrated by Moses himself. Now, Rabbi Gunther Plaut, I've mentioned, who was with the Holy Blossom Temple in Montreal for many years and wrote the shining commentary of modern times, I think, on the Torah, notes here, and I'm going to quote him a lot today, that Moses speaks homiletically in this book, like a preacher to the people who are listening to these discourses. Judaism looks at Moses as a prophet, even though he is not among the traditional prophets. But the fact that Moses is the voice that gives these addresses makes it even more authoritative than if it was just laid out as rules, according to Rabbi Plaut. That's his take on it. Obviously, we're going to have to be very picky in all of the stuff in Deuteronomy, but you can't leave out chapter 6, verse 4. For Jews, this is the most important and well-known single verse in the entire Torah. Listen up, Israel. Shema Yisrael. That first word, Shema, 3 little letters, and it means hear this. Hear. Yisrael, Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, the Lord our God, Adonai Echad. He is one. He is one, the Lord alone. When I was growing up, this was they were very decorous, in those days, it was rather decorous, the services were. And we used a lot of these and thous in our prayer book and everything. Those are sort of gone. And but Rabbi would always stand everybody up and let us repeat together the watchword of our faith and Shema Yisrael. And everybody would say, and then the choir would sing it, and it was just that moment, and then we would go on to the next verses, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, that also follow this immediately in Deuteronomy. So this watchword of our faith is something every Jew knows, even if he has no identification. I was a big fan of Burt Bacharach. I thought he was a very gifted composer, a little bit dated sometimes, but you can't deny the man's gift. He passed away at age 94 recently and very gifted, all that. And the article I read about him, I think it was Friday or something, said, he was so self-conscious about being Jewish that when he was a kid, he would taunt Jewish kids for being Jewish. And he was Jewish. I know those types, and they're an endless source of fascination to me. But I will tell you, even Burt Bacharach knew the Shema. I guarantee you. Someone who has no identification with Jewishness other than he is Jewish would know this word, these verses. So when this is in Deuteronomy, coming from Deuteronomy, it is so central. And the other thing that's central and interesting about it is that Judaism has no formal creed. There is nothing in liturgical Judaism, in any of our worship services, that's where we state what we believe. And this is as close as we come, which is why I think the Reform rabbis of that decorous era, when I was growing up, they all did this, because Rabbi Plaut talks about that phrase, the watchword of our faith. They must have heard it at a conference, and you know how they do. Today it's a listserv, but rabbis talk. And so they were all saying the watchword of our faith. Well, that's, it. It's not to say there aren't creeds and creedal statements in some of the Jewish hymns and poetry, but they're later. They're not liturgical. And we don't really have that, where creed is so central to Christian liturgy. Whether it's the Apostles' Creed or the old Nicene Creed or the modern creeds that have come up, since that time. And they reflect a lot of changes in the way the church thinks and the history and the doctrine as it evolves. And it is a living statement. But interestingly enough, this is as close as Judaism gets to having a creed. There are a lot of stories about the Shema. One of the most touching ones, and this is recounted on the afternoon of Yom Kippur, there's a martyrology part of the service where we recount some of the people who have died in the faith, who have died, for their faith. And the great story of Rabbi Akiva, who was part of the Pharisaic generation, a little later than most of the really great ones. But Akiva was a really poor guy who there's a great story that he wanted so much to attend the house of learning, but he didn't have anything to contribute financially toward its support. So he crawled up on the roof, and he could hear through something in the ceiling, that was something, and he would just live there. Well, it was really, really cold. And then all of a sudden, one day, somebody heard something up there. And they went to investigate and see what was on the roof. And they found him, little guy just shivering away, trying to, with his ear to the thing, trying to hear the teaching. They brought him in, and they let him be there, and he grew into the amazing sage he was, and all of that. Well, Akiba met his martyrdom, I believe it was with Rome. I think Rome was the culprit. And he was flayed and burned alive. And it is said that when he was dying and when he was burning, he starts to sing the Shema, chant the Shema Yisrael, and his students are around him, and they're just so upset, and they say, "Teacher, how can you even say this right now?" And he says, "All my life, I have puzzled over that phrase at the end, and I think I am beginning to understand it." And so with his very last breath, he chanted very slowly, "Adonai Echad," and he held the word Chad, that last syllable, until literally he just died. So with his last breath, he's saying, God is one. It's a very touching story. There's also a halakhic, or a rule-based reason for that. A Jew says the Shema when he or she wakes up first thing in the morning, and when they go to bed at night, and on one's deathbed. It is customary to recite the Shema, or have it recited for you if you cannot. So it is very central, and it has a lot of meaning. The next part of the Shema are the verses that immediately follow it. And this is so important, and Rabbi Moffick centers on this in his chapter on this, the idea of how do we love God. And the first bullet takes away the trinity of clauses. But it's, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And these are recited immediately after the Shema in every single Jewish worship service, holiday, regular day, daily, Sabbath, all of them. This is central. The 3 bullet points, all your is really it. But the first part, your heart, soul, and might, there have been so many commentaries, and Moffick talks about some beautiful interpretations of that in the chapter of that. The second bullet is to take the commandments to heart, bind them, in your heart, and teach them to your children in every possible way. And of course, it's going to be specific. When you lie down, when you rise up, ergo the reciting of the Shema and this prayer, when you wake up, when you go to sleep. So when you, in every possible, when you lie down, when you rise up, when you walk by the way, and all of these things. So it basically in everything you do. And of course, there's a lot of commentary about walking by the way. Well, anything about walking tends to elicit the idea of action and of how one lives one's life. When you go forth in the world, show the love of God even in the way you walk, that is, in the things you do. That doesn't sound unfamiliar, right? I mean, Christian teaching is full of that. That's kind of what we do, right? All right. So, so there's that. Excuse me. There was a 19th century Russian rabbi who's known by the acronym the Malbim. He was a linguist, and but 19th century, fairly. I mean, Judaism, that's like last Thursday. A rabbi who was identified by the acronym Malbim noted that the juxtaposition of verses 4 and 5, the first part, the Lord God is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and might, linking the idea of God's unity with the love of God, and this is a quote, suggests that when we recognize God as one, we are challenged to love God as the source of all that happens to us, both the good and the evil. Now, last week, we heard Job preached, a lesson from Job preached. And Job immediately comes to mind when we talk about how can we love God when bad things happen. And this idea that God is the source of good and of evil is a very touchy subject. It's a very uncomfortable story. There is another great rabbinic story of a man who had lost his wife and children in a pogrom. He addresses God as follows: Master of the universe, you have done much to make me forsake my faith. Know then that in spite of it all, I am a Jew, and a Jew I will remain, and nothing you will yet do to me will avail you anything and turn me away from loving you. To me, the most wonderful line in Job is his statement, though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. The Holocaust, of course, was a much more contemporary test of faith for Jews. And this idea that we love God, that we recognize that even though, this is also where you shall not put the Lord your God to the test, also comes from Deuteronomy. Jesus quotes that line. But when God tests us, we will respond by defiantly loving him all the more. Write them on your hands. This is the origin of the what's called phylacteries or tefillin in Hebrew. I should have put a picture. But in traditional Judaism, the men, when they pray daily, they put on these little wooden boxes that have the Deuteronomy verse here on this verse in the little boxes on parchment, handwritten by a scribe. And they're beautiful. They're wood, usually varnished pretty, and this, and then one that goes around here with another box here. And they put it on one arm, and here. It's called tefillin, which means prayer. So they're prayer assets. They're like beads in a rosary, you know. I mean, they're just assets to, a physical asset to prayer. But it derives from this vote. These verses, write them on your hands, and as we used to say, frontlets between your eyes. And on the doorposts of your home, you know what that refers to? Yeah, the mezuzah, which is the little decorative thing that you'll see on a front door of a Jewish home, tilted from the outside to the inside. We call it a backslash now, but you know what I mean. And on the doorposts of your house. And inside the mezuzah is another parchment with the Deuteronomy, these passages here. So it's a very, very central idea in Judaism, theologically and even in practice. Okay, the second discourse. There's a lot covered here. Once again, we hear about idolatry, you know, and I may just leave that alone. I think it's, you know, God has a real thing about other gods. I mean, he really does. First, he tells us, I am the Lord, and I only am the Lord. And then he has to tell us even more about idolatry. You know, I tell my classes that sometimes I tend to repeat points because I'm worried they're not getting them. I said, sometimes I will drag a dead horse in this classroom and start beating it. So if you would just tell me when you see me doing that, I will quit. All right. Rabbi Plout calls the second section of the second discourse the good life. And this is mostly chapter 8. And it outlines the consequences of being obedient to God's law in terms of both material and spiritual rewards. This is where, in verse 8 of that chapter, that we read of the land of olive trees and honey. And we are cautioned that our hearts not become proud and haughty and consider how our own power and might are the sources of our blessing. Verse 3 is the well-known phrase that we all know, that man does not live by bread alone. But until you've read the full verse in context, it's kind of lost. You have to read the whole thing. Here's the whole thing. God subjected you to the hardship of hunger and then gave you manna to eat, which neither you nor your fathers had ever known, in order to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but that man may live on anything that the Lord decrees. The clothes upon you did not wear out, nor did your feet swell these 40 years. I'm glad he talked about feet. People don't want to talk about feet very much, but, they're pain. I mean, sometimes, that can ruin your whole day. But here, that's the Torah. They're going to go from these, mighty acts of God to, and your feet didn't swell. It's everything. It's all there. But, here it is. The good life, don't be, just realize where the source of all blessing comes from. Why was he not able to enter the promised land? Not because he took credit for strife. very almost flat. It sounds like a detective reading a police report of the incident of the crime. It's almost, there's no passion. It's just matter of fact. And Moses died, and he was 120 years old, and no one knows his burial to his face. And then it gets to the last sentence, and this is in that last Torah portion, after Moses' big song, his final song, where he charges all the tribes and blesses all the tribes, and it's amazing, this hymn of hope. By the way, okay. I'm on my peroration here, so I need to not break character. But there is some thought that the last of Deuteronomy was written by Joshua. The ordination of Joshua in front of everybody with the words, "Be strong and of a good courage," was the best advice anybody could give somebody who's in charge of anything Jewish. But I'll just leave it at that. But at any rate, but again, conferring the authority in front of everybody. It's why we don't swear the President of the United States in a private chamber unless we absolutely have to. There are always witnesses, and they had a lot of witnesses when Joshua took the mantle. And then it has this one summary here. "And there hath not arisen a prophet since in Israel like unto Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face." Now, liturgically in the church year, the traditional gospel that's read next week, the Sunday before Lent, is of the Transfiguration on the mountain. It is mentioned in three. It's a story that it's a little crazy and a little mystical and a little supernatural. Not like in the magic sense, but just beyond natural. Yet 3 of the 4 Gospels reference that story. That gives it some kind of significance, one would think. And Moses and Elijah, neither of whom were buried, or that we know of their burial place, are the 2 figures. And the face-to-face, a big part of the Transfiguration story is that their faces were shining, and that Moses' face shone when he came from an encounter with God. So the Lord knew face to face is something that's not really something that's going to be in anyone's gift except the most rare person ever. But it doesn't stop us from looking for God's face. And I think with a little imagination, you know where you will find it. You know where to find God's face. And then you'll be amazed because of how easy it is to find. And with this, the story of Moshe Rabbeinu, as Jews call him, Moses, our teacher, the teacher and spiritual father of Judaism, with all his faults and all his stubbornness and all his frustrations, comes to an end, and does the book of Deuteronomy, as does the Torah with a T, with a big T. But the little Torah, which is all the rest of it, continues, and immediately when we read that short portion, we get out a second Torah scroll, and we read, "In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth." And we start again, the very same service. You have those 2 readings together. It never stops. There's a verse in the Talmud that says, "Turn it and turn it and turn it again, for all is contained therein." If you think you know everything the Torah has to tell you, you ain't looking hard enough, because there's more there. I have been so privileged to lead this with you, and I'm so glad you asked me, and I love this book. It's really good. And it's been a really growth experience for me, and I just want to thank you. This has been a glorious 6 weeks, and I've loved it. So thank you very much. Do you want to get on? Could we have a little question?
Yeah, go.
Yeah, feedback. Questions. Feedback, whatever. We never have time. I'm always running out of here. But Daniel told me he actually likes rehearsing the choir. And and the choir sings better when he directs them. So I'm just gonna enjoy that. And does anybody have any closing comments? We've covered a lot of ground here.
What's the next series you're going to teach us?
I have no clue, but I'd love to do it again. Anything else?
Lester, will you redefine the difference between Jewish grace and Christian?
Oh, it's so new for me. I tell you, I've been searching and searching for this idea. I never really understood what grace meant, and because of its centrality in Christian thought. But I think it's sort of, if I can say, it's really about the reverse of the way Christianity centers on that God's grace is so great that it enables pardon and forgiveness. The way Jewish understanding of grace goes is that the grace we show to one another is really it. And there's an old tradition around Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and people know this, that you have to make up and reconcile with someone you're on the outs with before God will grant you repentance, will grant the repentance you seek on Yom Kippur. If two people who are at odds do not make up, they haven't fulfilled the obligation of repentance, and no amount of God's grace will be as effective. I mean, God's grace is always effective, but that's the point. That's my best understanding on it. I have to tell you, one time when I was at St. Andrew's Episcopal over in Glen Iris, Francis Walter, who,
Lester,
yeah.
sorry, I need to interrupt 1 second. I apologize. Looking for Alan Harrington.
Well, okay, I don't know. That might be one of those definitions that raises even more questions. What I'd explain to you is my limited understanding. You probably need a true theologian. Get a rabbi in here and ask him about grace, okay? That's as good a final word.
All the classes, all the combined classes, thank you. You have given us entertaining as well as informative and a new perspective on the Old Testament that we certainly most Christians didn't have. So we would like to offer you a very token of our appreciation. And if that token were a book in the Old Testament, I want to prove that we were actually paying attention. That would actually, we would title that L'chaim.
Oh,
Now, there are reasons for that. There are reasons for that. The first reason is we learned that the title should be a derivative of the first significant word in text. So that's one of the things that we learned. Also, we learned that L'chaim is a combination word of words that represent the number 10 and number 8 and number 8. So in Judaism, that has some significance, and together that word means to life, and certainly you have brought life to the Old Testament. So we appreciate that. And the final reason is that's the only Jewish word I know. We do have a few announcements, if you will. First, I want to give a big thank you to those people who have made this production possible. Amos in the IT group, Amy Skinner, and those people in charge of facilities, and most importantly, to the person that's pulled all this together with hours and hours, and that is to Tom Owen, our program director for the Aldersgate class. Tom, thank you very much. There is an event that starts this afternoon. In fact, it's already started, I understand, the Rise Against Hunger event. If you have not participated, I think there are still still opportunities to do that, although most of them I think are tomorrow. So if you have not, if you would like, there's still availability to do that. One other thing is Ash Wednesday is 10 days from now, so please keep that in mind, and please be aware of the special services that are ongoing around Ash Wednesday. I'm not sure, do you have any additional specifics to add to that? Does anybody know some specific details? Pay attention, as I'm sure will be out in the reminder. And finally, I do want to put a word in for all the 28,000 plus people that they are finding out in Turkey that have been affected. Those are the deaths that are associated with your earthquakes there in Turkey, but the countless others, the thousands and thousands of others who are now homeless or in otherwise needy. So please keep all of those in your prayers. Any other announcements from any of the other classes? Don't forget, Aldersgate class will start a series next Sunday with Paul McCracken on the 15 essential biblical texts. 15 essential biblical texts. Thank you. Lindy?
I have a quick something to say. It's really for everybody. I gave a gift to Tom at the beginning of this class as to thank him for many, many things, and one of them is doing this class. And it's a DVD, an audio book of, and I'm telling you, you'll know why in a minute. It's called The Diaries of Adam and Eve by Mark Twain. And the actor that plays Adam is Mandy Patinkin. It's quite humorous, but what I really want to tell you is the music on this audio book is composed by Wesley.
He was nominated for a Grammy for that? Wow.
It's not a DVD, I'm sorry, it's a CD, it's an audio book.
Well, thank you for all of your participation, and again, if you're interested in participating with the next series, please let me know. Thank you very much.
Jewish station or Methodist University or Methodist Church.